welcome. And we're now heading into part two of a two-part special conversation with Techdirt's Mike Masnick. Mike is a go-to guy for me to understand policy implications, everything from privacy to content moderation, First Amendment law, and basically everything that all of a sudden has been catapulted to the front of the conversation as it relates to how businesses and large tech platforms manage their myriad of problems that now have become hot button issues in politics. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Let's change our focus with our tech policy expert, Mike Masnick, to data privacy, another big issue, of course, for every company in the world. And certainly large companies that are now, well into the practice of collecting a lot of information about their customers, mainly so that they can serve those customers better. But of course, there's been in the past 5 years a lot of hue and cry about big tech platforms and surveillance capitalism. And if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, and so on and so forth. And a lot of legislation and talk of legislation across the United States and in Europe, Australia, Asia, and other countries, as well as legislation here in the United States specific to California and other states. So let's get into it, Mike. As I said, nearly all large companies gather data on their customers. But there has been legislation that regulates the gathering of that information. And in particular in Europe, something called GDPR, the Generalized Data Protection Regulations, and in California, the CCPA. What has this legislation changed as it relates to how companies gather information?
Well, what has it changed realistically, or what has it changed in the minds of people? I think it's one of these things where it's kind of hard to say. What we've seen in practice is that what those two laws in particular have done, targeting the EU and California, is mainly create a huge compliance headache for all sorts of companies. Created a huge space for privacy lawyers mainly, and compliance experts. It's certainly in some cases driven out some small companies and given more power to the larger companies who promise that they will, keep you in compliance and not have you violate these laws. Though there are many people who believe that everybody is violating these laws based on how they're written. So it's really just become a huge sort of regulatory mess, and it's a little unclear if it's actually done anything to help anyone's privacy.
They seemed well-intentioned. I mean, I've read the laws. I watched the debate as the laws were, being formulated and put through their paces. And in the end, it was hard to argue with the intent behind it, which was personal information is being harvested, on all of us by companies large and small. We need rights over that information. We need to be able to grant permissions, have the right to edit or download copies of it, say yes or no to how it was used. I mean, it seems like a good idea. What went wrong?
I think it's funny. It's privacy, like obscenity, is one of those things that is not well defined, and it's one of these like I know it when I see it kind of things, and that makes for a very difficult situation when you try to regulate it. And I think that in many people's minds, when they think about privacy at first, they think it's sort of this thing we have to protect our data. But what does that mean in reality? And what does protecting our privacy actually mean? I've been trying to convince people to try and think of privacy as more of a trade-off than a thing. Everything that you do has some privacy implications, but usually the trade-off is worth it. Again, everybody has sort of a different level and a different set of trade-offs, and yet these privacy laws sort of try and set up effectively a one-size-fits-all world for that. And the end result is that the only thing that they can do is basically just try and say, well, you have to get permission and you have to give some sort of control, but it's a very confusing and complex control, so no users fully understand it. And the permission part just becomes a checkbox that everybody, you just get a pop-up and everybody has to click on it to get to the content that they want, and they don't realize what it is. It hasn't better informed them and hasn't actually created any more transparency. It's just created this annoying middle step that then the companies think they're okay, and the users have no idea and just feel they have to do it. And in the end, it's just created this compliance mess and done nothing for actual privacy or actually giving control to the end users.
So I'm sure everyone listening has had that experience. What is often called a click wrap. You agree to our terms and service. No one reads the terms of service because it's in the way. It's in between you and where you want to go. So you just say okay. What might be a better way of approaching this? And are there proposals now that are going to be considered this year by the new administration here in the United States that might be a bit more effective or enlightened?
I think there are a number of different proposals that will come about, and I'm not convinced that any of them are any more enlightened on the regulatory side. I think that almost everybody who's pushing legislation in this space has again, this view of privacy that doesn't fit with reality. And I think it's just very hard for people to conceptualize, how do you regulate privacy in a meaningful way that takes into account that there are some times when I do want to share this information, there are sometimes that I don't, and it's not a blanket thing. I shouldn't have to just click once, and that means that all the, I've given permission forever in some cases, but how to do it in a way that isn't intrusive and annoying. I think that the big fight in the US, at least right now, regarding different privacy laws is whether or not we're going to have 50 different states with 50 different approaches, or we're going to have one federal standard. Because if you have to comply with 50 different state laws, not to mention all the international laws, it becomes a huge mess. And again, sort of plays right into the hands of the biggest players rather than the smaller players.
In our last conversation, Mike, you mentioned an architecture for the internet that is protocol driven as opposed to platform driven. And it strikes me that architecture might be exactly what we need to manage privacy in a new way, where people have the ability to reveal parts of themselves in some kind of exchange for a benefit. Privacy is very nuanced. Sometimes you want to see people put something in your shopping cart. Sometimes you don't. Depends on what you're buying and who's looking, right? So do you think that's yet another reason why moving to a different architecture for the internet at the kind of, at the lower level of how the internet works makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the protocol approach really helps on the privacy front too, because, again, some of this depends on how it's architected, but certainly one key approach to it is that you effectively control your data. So rather than, relying on Facebook or Google or whoever to hold all of your data and make these decisions, you can hold it. And there are a number of different ways that this can be set up, and it would, get very deep in the weeds to sort of break out the different ways to do it. But the key aspect is if you were in control, and if a service like a Facebook or a Twitter or YouTube or smaller sites wanted to make use of your data, instead of giving it all to them and having them hold on to it and have to protect it, you allow them to look at your protected, encrypted, data collection, and you could see which pieces they wanted to access, which pieces they wanted to use, and why. And you could deny it on individual levels, or allow it for a certain amount of time. There are all different levers that you can pull that put you in control and put the end user in control, rather than the big tech companies.
And in such a system might also allow me to, for example, trust Gillette or Pampers and say, you can have my data for as long as you want, for as much time as you want, until I decide I don't trust you anymore, right? And that framework, is sort of like I give my email to Gillette because I sign up for the Razor Club, right? And I like that. It sounds like a lot safer way to be in a good relationship with your customer, as opposed to trusting this intermediaries where you're not totally in charge, even as a big company, with how that information is being managed by a third party.
Yeah, I think actually it can get a lot more interesting too when you start to peel back the layers and see. And the word that you used in there that I think is really important is trust, because it enables some really interesting trust models. And in fact, you can start to do some interesting things, including having different people vouch for different entities, for other people, for companies, and say, like, I will trust the companies that you trust, or this person is a validated customer or something like that. There are all different levels of trust and validation and reputation that can be built into such a system that create all sorts of benefits. It creates a lot of really nice incentives that I think leads to a better world than the one that we're currently in.
Mike, I really appreciate you having a conversation with us. I want to ask one last question, and it's how might companies like Procter and Gamble work with your company? I mean, you're obviously a smart guy. You do interesting things. I know that you've got a lot of events and consulting. Give us a couple minute overview of Techdirt and how people might engage with you and your company.
Sure. So there are two elements to what we do. We have Techdirt, which is sort of a media property, and we're always happy to talk to people about sponsoring different aspects of what we do, and we do a bunch of cool stuff on Techdirt. And then we have sort of the research consulting event side of what we do, which is called the Copia Institute, which is at copia.is. And what we've been doing there lately is really trying to take interesting approaches to get people to think through these ideas. We've talked about it as setting up games. So they're usually sort of event-based games, because games are really interesting for changing people's perspective. In a normal event or a panel or whatever, people come to ready to sort of promote their viewpoint. Whereas if we put you into a game and put you into a scenario and say, you're taking a different perspective here, and you're in this world, and you need to make decisions based on this world that you're in, it often helps people to think through different ways that things could happen. So we sort of describe it as helping people to either understand the present or explore the future. So we've been doing a bunch of different things on that front, and I'm happy to talk about any of it.
Wonderful. Well, Mike, thank you for joining us. I thought it was a great conversation. I learned a lot, and hopefully everybody listening will as well. Mike Masnick, thank you for joining us for a Signal Conversation.
Thanks for having me.